We'll start in just a moment or two. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this CND webinar, Lakenheath, its role in the US war machine. I'm sure you're all very aware the problems confronting us at Lakenheath at the moment. We know there are big developments taking place there, readying for the US nuclear weapons to come back to the base. This is one of CND's priority campaigns at the moment, and we hope and are very pleased that you're all engaged in confronting this problem alongside us. This evening, we want to hear more about the developments at Lakenheath and the nuclear weapons. We want to hear more about those. We have a great expert, Hans Kristensen, who's joined us this evening. But we're also going to look at the wider role of Lakenheath too, because we know that not only in nuclear weapons terms, but also in wider military terms, Lakenheath does play a role in the US war machine. So I can just recap a little bit on the kind of work that CND has done in the past around these bases in East Anglia and slightly further afield. During the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon, for example, we became aware that both Lakenheath and RAF Mildenhall nearby were used for the deployment of cluster munitions. In 2006, peace activists exposed the suspected presence of cluster bombs there and blockaded a weapons storage facility. We also, around the same time, organised peace camps, not only at RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk, but also at Bryce Norton in nearby Oxfordshire. And again, that was against what we described as the murderous cargo flights, which transported weapons to the Middle East. It turned out that Mildenhall was a fueling stop between Kelly in Texas, where the US was keeping its weapons, and between there before flying on from Mildenhall to Israel. So quite a strong record there. We also know that in 2008, US fighter jets were being used to bomb Iraq and Afghanistan from Lakenheath. And even as far back as 1999, we know that Lakenheath-based F-15E fighter jets were used as part of NATO's bombing campaign of Serbia and Kosovo, in that case, again, using cluster bombs. So there's quite a strong record, not only of those bases being used for other people's wars, notably US wars, but there's also quite a strong record of the peace movement actually taking action against them. And this is very much the track that CND is on today. We want to take action against the nuclear weapons there, and we want to take action against other military use of those bases in the US war machine. So we're going to have a very, very interesting discussion this evening. We're going to hear from each of our speakers for around about 7 or 8 minutes. And then after that, we'll turn to you, the audience, for Q&A. So can I ask you, please, as we go along, put your questions in the Q&A box. And then I'll put those questions to the speakers. So I'm pleased to see that our third speaker, Roger McKenzie, a new Vice-President of CND, has now joined us too. So without further ado, I'm going to move first to invite Hans Kristensen from the Federation of American Scientists to speak to us. Welcome, Hans.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to a good debate about this. There's a fair amount of news recently and over the last couple of years regarding Lakenheath and the nuclear role. And I have prepared just a few slides that I'm going to share with you. And if anybody wants them after, I'll be happy to share them as well. And can you see it? They look okay? assuming everybody can see them.
Yeah, coming up clearly there.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let me just quickly start with the overview here, what has happened over the last couple decades here, very briefly. At Lakenheath, the U.S. Air Force installed 33 nuclear vaults back in the 90s. And, this used to be a huge nuclear base in terms of the storage of nuclear weapons. And for example, when Clinton issued his nuclear employment guidance authorization back in 2000, there were 100 B-61 nuclear bombs earmarked for Lakenheath. But then things changed, and the W. Bush administration decided to significantly reduce the number of weapons in Europe, cut the overall number in half. And if it didn't happen that early at that, in terms of Lakenheath, then it's happened over the next couple of years later. That in 2008, we found out that the weapons had all been withdrawn from Lakenheath. And that was a significant development, obviously. That was the complete withdrawal of all U.S. nuclear weapons from England, United Kingdom. It's completely unprecedented, of course. They go way, way, way back. But recently, over the last couple of years, we have seen signs in U.S. documents that the mission is coming back, so to speak. We don't know what this means yet in terms of whether the weapons will actually be deployed there, but the mission is being revamped, facilities modernized and added and what have you to be able to accommodate this mission. We saw it first in 22 and in 23 again. And then, of course, as you all saw here earlier this year, the Telegraph found some other documents that also mentioned the nuclear mission was coming back. So the upgrade, of course, is very broad. Not only the fighters themselves, the F-35s, those squadrons are being stood up, to full capacity, but also to the nuclear weapons vaults, the nuclear weapons storage system, command and control, itself is now being upgraded. More than just being sort of a reserve caretaker status, they're bringing it up to full function. And we see new facilities going in that's supposed to house additional people that are supposed to serve this function. We see new guards posts being put in or contracts signed for them. And then, of course, in the very near future, the B-61-12 nuclear bomb is going to go to Europe. Remains to be seen if it's going to end up in Lakenheath as well, but certainly it'll go to the bases where there currently are nuclear weapons stored in Europe. We've seen this in documents, but as a countermeasure, we have also seen an effort to reduce nuclear transparency, because as soon as we started talking about these new developments in the documents, the Pentagon cleaned out some of these documents in the new version, so they didn't mention the countries at all. So this is an interesting development, while insisting that other nuclear weapon states have to be more transparent. Here's an example of, at least in this case, the United States going back in terms of transparency. So the question is, of course, what is this going to do for the nuclear status at Lakenheath? Here I want to remind you of two different statements that have been given over the last few years. Stoltenberg in 21 very clearly said they had no plan of stationing nuclear weapons in any other countries than where they already were at the time. And in 2003, during a visit to Finland, the head of NATO's nuclear command, nuclear planning in those days, or nuclear program, said that there was no need to change where these weapons are deployed, and didn't anticipate any change in the sharing arrangement, for example, in the near term. And just a few weeks ago, I had a chance to ask a top NATO nuclear official if those statements still stand, and the message was that he believed they do. So what does that mean for Lakenheath? Well, we can see that there are these upgrades. We can see the contracts. We can see all the indications. But we're also hearing statements like you can see here from officials. They don't have any plans, at least when these statements were made, to deploy nuclear weapons elsewhere than they currently are. So one of the options for Lakenheath is that it'll become a base if it doesn't receive the weapons themselves, in the very near future. It would become sort of a backup deployment site. And one of the reasons for that is that one of the responses that NATO is taking in response to Russia is that it is increasing the flexibility of the dual capable aircraft in Europe, the posture. And so there are places where the weapons are all the time, but there are other bases where they can be moved to if they need to. And it could be potentially that Lakenheath becomes one of those. You could imagine all sorts of scenarios. You can also imagine a wildcard scenario where things go very bad in Turkey, and they decide to move the weapons out of Turkey, and Lakenheath would be a base that could absorb those weapons. But the wild card, of course, are depending on where you stand on this, the worst case scenario would be that the weapons physically are brought into Lakenheath again. We don't know. It's not clear from the documents and the conversations we've had that there is a plan to physically return the weapons now to Lakenheath, but it is certainly, regardless, being ready to be able to take them if such a decision is made. So I'm going to stop here and just hope triggered some responses, and I can answer questions, of course.
Thanks very much indeed, Hans. Oops, my timer going off. dead on 7 minutes. Brilliant. So that's given us a lot of food for thought, and it's really great to have really accurate information. So now I'm going to turn to our next speaker, who is Roger McKenzie. Roger, as I mentioned earlier, is the new Vice-President of CND, and he's going to talk to us a bit about the global perspective on US wars and the role of UK bases in those. So big welcome, Roger. Over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, everybody, for giving up your evening to come to what I think is a really important meeting. First of all, my apologies for being late in joining the meeting. That was because I was actually in a meeting with some African and US and Canadian, in fact, trade unionists, black trade unionists. And we meet pretty much every week. And part of that discussion that we have every week is to kind of survey the world scene and to look at what that actually means for peace and security, but also for building trade unionism and for building kind of collectivism and building activity for progressive causes around the world. What was really clear from our discussion is that as we're heading into, we're in this year of a US presidential election. What was clear to everybody in that meeting was that whichever one of the two likely candidates, Biden and Trump, whichever one of them wins, we're still going to be trapped in this international cycle of the US kind of preferring to spend their money on warfare rather than welfare. I was having a look at some stats, and more than 80 million Americans, so pretty much anybody born in America after 2001, their normal state of affairs has been for the US to be in a war with somebody since then. They've been at war for 231 of the last 245 years. That's an incredible stat. Now, when you just throw out those stats, that can be seen as just being quite, kind of nerdy. Well, there's a bit of information that I found out that you can learn about. But actually, there's real people behind these statistics. There's real people who are at the receiving end of these wars that the US has been fighting. Many people on this call, I dare say, will remember, as I do, in the early 80s when we used to describe Britain as this aircraft carrier for the US. And that's kind of, you know, we went through a stage where it wasn't quite that, but there was still a battle to be had. But now it seems to me that we're back to that again. So why are we moving back to that again? Well, I mean, I think we could go. We have to make sure that we understand the importance of the arms manufacturers in all of this and the way that they plunder the global south, in particular for the resources that they need to be able to produce the weapons that they have. Now, for me, that is one of the major campaigns for CND and the peace movement generally, that we really have to understand the way that the exploitation of the global south is being used to bolster the military industrial complex across the global north, so the US, Britain, France, Germany, you know, a whole range of these countries. And I think that has to be core to the way that we organize our campaigns for peace. We have to attack really that core of power that exists within the arms manufacturers who buy and sell politicians in the United States and Britain. And they buy and sell these politicians because actually they need the wars to take place to be able to sell their weapons, to be able to make their immense profits. So what is it that we can do? Well, you know, I think we really need to be doing, you know, expanding the work that I know we're already doing in terms of building that international peace movement. But the peace movement isn't just about those peace movements that we have within the global north. You know, really, you know, excellent work that CND, Stop the War, and others have been doing across Britain, but also the peace movement, really strong peace movement that I know exists around the US and Canada, but also looking at what we can do to help build that movement for peace within the global south as well, because in the end, I think that's going to be central to making a real difference in terms of what happens. One of the things that I always think of is if you continue to do the same things that you've always done, then you're going to get pretty much the same results. So if we have been doing all this excellent campaigning for all these years and the US and Britain still feel that they're able to bring nuclear weapons, as it seems that they may well be doing, back onto our shores, then I think that's something where we need to identify how we can broaden our movement to be a genuinely worldwide movement for peace, rather than the kind of excellent but maybe not inclusive enough peace movement that involves the global south, involves nations of Africa, involves Asia within that campaign. Now, there's particular difficulties with that because sometimes we're not dealing with governments in some of those areas that are particularly progressive. We're dealing with some governments that really want to kind of line their own pockets in some instances rather than stand up for peace and security. And I think we have to be part of the movement that helps to take that on as well. So in the final minute that I've got, I just want to really make a plea to everybody that when we talk about our movement for peace, is that we talk about a movement for peace that's inclusive across the globe, that involves the global south, because they are faced with some real fundamental problems of how they can make sure that the money that is spent that flows out of their country, into the global south, can actually be used to build the economies of those nations. I'll stop there and thank you very much again for giving me the opportunity to speak and for the golden opportunity to be Vice President of CND. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much indeed, Roger. And it's really for us to thank you and thank you for that contribution and really broadening out the way that we're looking at these issues. It's really appreciated. So now I'm going to turn to our final speaker, Tom Unterrainer, who is the chair of CND. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Kate, and an enormous thanks to Hans for his, not just his recent work exposing the reality of what is unfolding and the risks that are posed by developments at Lakenheath, but for a very long track record of looking forensically. We hear a lot in Britain about the importance of forensic insight and forensic analysis in all sorts of spheres, but Hans really does contribute massively to our understanding of what is happening with nuclear developments in the US, in the UK, and indeed across the world. And thank you very much to Roger also for his clear call, his clear internationalist call, which makes it very clear to us all that the peace movement in the UK, which CND is a central part of, is not alone. And our concerns are not confined to these small, cold at the moment and often rainy islands. Which brings me to this image behind me. I'm leaning back. Behind me, you'll see Peter Kennard's 1980 photo montage titled Airstrip 1. And Roger made reference to the perception that the UK often acts as an aircraft carrier for the United States. But this is Peter Kennard's marvellous photo montage artwork, Airstrip 1. And it's an absurd and a grotesque image, is it not? It's absurd and grotesque. But as we know from Kafka and others, we often find things absurd and grotesque when we recognize the essential truth of what's contained within. Now, this artwork was created the year that I was born, 1980. And to my mind, Kennard's striking work functions in three ways, at the very least. First, it represents the truth. In 1980, as now, and we'll get to that, and we've heard some of that, Britain was home to an extensive network of US bases, including nuclear, that stretched north to south, east to west. Second, it speaks of anxiety, a wholly rational anxiety. The image, and I'll lean back again, shows missiles and jets launching away from these islands. But also there, in the bottom right-hand corner, are the radar dishes. They're on constant watch, on constant alert. Why are they there? Because all of this murderous technology that we see depicted here made the United Kingdom, as it makes it now, a target. Far from offering defense or security, these weapons are a threat, a global threat. Thirdly, this image represents dominance, or the essence of being dominated. Airstrip 1, this image here, represents the fact that Britain does not, to all intents and purposes, have a fully independent foreign policy. And this is certainly the case with regards to nuclear weapons and nuclear policy. Perhaps the most striking thing about this 44-year-old artwork is that with a bit of updating, new missiles, newer jets, it could just as easily have been created in 2024 as in 1980. Which brings us to the first point: truth matters. The truth is this: Britain is still home to an extensive network of US bases. And given what we know about developments at Lakenheath, it could be home to US nuclear weapons once again. That is, unless we stop it from happening. There are at least 17 US military facilities spread across England, from Bude in Cornwall, home to a joint US-UK intelligence collection station, for which the US paid for most of the infrastructure and technology, to Fairford, home to the only airstrip in Europe where the US can launch and land heavy bomber aircraft, to Crowton, a US Air Force communications hub, and the place through which commands to start a nuclear war will be transmitted. To Menwith Hill and Fylingdales in Yorkshire. From Menwith Hill, the US National Security Agency intercepts and monitors communications. That is, it's a spy base. It's the base from which we know, because of revelations from Edward Snowden and others, the US used to spy on a variety of people, including the democratically elected leaders of European states, Angela Merkel, former Chancellor of Germany, included. It also functions as part of the US missile defense system. At Fylingdales, there is an enormous joint US-UK radar facility for tracking and targeting missiles. We go from Yorkshire to Mildenhall, a US Air Force base just south of Lakenheath. And Lakenheath is the base where we know that between 1954 and 2008, the United States housed free-fall nuclear bombs. We also know, because it was announced, that it is currently home to new nuclear-capable F-35 jets. And we also know, as Hans has explained, that it's undergoing significant upgrading work with a possible view to hosting new US nuclear bombs. Almost all of these places operate under the name or the signature of the Royal Air Force, RAF. It's RAF Menwith Hill, RAF Fylingdales, RAF Lakenheath, RAF Mildenhall, when in fact we know these are permanent US facilities. Another absurd and grotesque situation. And we should call things by their proper names. These are US bases. These are US Air Force facilities. These are US National Security Agency facilities on these islands. Let's look at some of the recent history.
You've got 1 minute, USA, by the way. One minute.
Okay. Kate went over some of it. We know that cluster munitions were based there. We know that cluster munition missions were flown from RAF Lakenheath. We know that the United Kingdom, whilst being a party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the United States is not. We know that the cluster munitions were there in 2006. Are they still there now? If so, whose decision was it? If the idea that the US Air Force and US military already carries out extensive operations in the UK makes you anxious, then you should be anxious. And the idea that US nuclear bombs look set to return should exponentially increase your anxiety, especially in the current context. For this reason, if for no other, then we should dispense with anxiety and turn to determination, a determined effort to stop the deployment of new nuclear weapons and a determined campaign to send the US war machine packing from this little island. What agreements are there? What treaties? What policies? What democratic accountability? What opportunity for scrutiny, deliberation, questions, or opposition exists in the United Kingdom with respect to all of these policies, all of these agreements, which allow and which enable the functioning of the US war machine in the United Kingdom? Where is the democracy? Where is our ability to intervene? Where is it? When questioned, the United Kingdom government says we cannot comment on US military decisions. That's the way they drone on and on all of the time. And this is simply not good enough. It's not good enough for a whole host of reasons. But if you're in any doubt about the gravity of the situation, imagine the fact that by this time next year, if the polls are to be believed, if the commentary in the UK newspapers and US newspapers are to be believed, Mr. Trump could very well be in the White House again. Now, CND campaigns for the abolition of all nuclear weapons, whether we've got a Labour or a Conservative government, whether Biden or Trump are in power. And we will campaign to prevent US nuclear weapons from returning to Lakenheath, regardless of who is in power. And all of us here, I urge you to join us in this campaign. Thanks, Kate, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. So we've got just under half an hour now for some Q&A. You've been putting fantastic questions in the box. So what I think I'll do is just divide them into two, essentially, and put them to the panel in two rounds. So some of them are aimed at particular people. So panel, don't feel you have to answer all of them. Obviously, answer the ones that are for you, so to speak. Anyway, so first of all, there's just a few that popped up while Hans was talking, of great interest to all of us. So I'm just run through those and then come on to some of the others. So first of all, from Tim Street, he says, I've read that when used in conjunction with an F-35 jet fighter, the B-61-12 would be delivered by a satellite-guided missile rather than used as a free-fall gravity bomb. Is this correct? So that's one. Then from Martin Tiller, if we can't be sure whether the weapons are back at Lakenheath, the nuclear weapons, can the UK's enemies, can they? What do you think Putin makes of it? Will he just assume that they are there and plan accordingly? Ray Towie says, how large is the B-61 warhead and how many can be carried by the F-35? And then some other ones, not specifically for you, Hans, from Tom Cuthbert. He says, recent protests have been characterised as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. Are these accusations to cover complicity by US, UK in the dirty wars around the Middle East and elsewhere? Tom, that's one of your big picture questions that we're used to taking. Good for you. And then one to Roger. How can we work more closely with trade unionists in the light of recent TUC policy calling for more arms spending and an understandable focus on wage struggles? That's very important for us, I must say. And then to Tom, there's one. How can we get people to engage with the Lakenheath developments when they live at the other side of the country? Fair point. People may think it's a localised problem. So that's the first set of questions. Who would like to go first? Hans, do you want to go first? Because those first ones were you.
I'll jump in.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, let me start from the top as far as I can remember. I have also tried to answer some of these, in the Q&A function. So the B-61-12 is not a satellite-guided GPS system. It uses an internal navigation system to steer itself toward the target more accurately. And then it has this, these fins, this tail kit that enables it to, adjust its direction. But it's not a GPS system. And as far as I know, because the explicit interest was that they didn't want to use a JDAM at the time because JDAM can be jammed. A GPS can be jammed. Anyway, but the effect of this tail kit is that it can hit its target, what I think is something in the order of 3 times more accurately than existing B-61 bombs. So it's a significant increase in accuracy. The yield, it has 4 selective yields as far as we can figure out. One is very, very small. It's only 0.3 kiloton. That's like 300 tons of TNT. Very small for a nuclear weapon. It has a second setting that's about 1.5 kiloton, and then it has a 10 kiloton, and then it has a 50 kiloton setting. So, the pilot can choose what he wants to use when he's going up. The question about do adversaries know if the weapons are there? Yeah, I think they have a pretty good idea about what the status is. They may not know all the details, but things like that, they probably have a fairly good idea. How many bombs can you have in an F-35? It can carry 2 internally, 1 on each side internally. You can presumably also equip it with external fixtures under the wings that in theory would be able to carry more, but there's no point in that. 2 is more than enough. And then finally, what is the stage of the rollout of the B-61 now? Well, right now, the weapon is in full-scale production here in the United States. And they've finished about half of the weapons that are going to produce. They are already assigned to the B-2 bomb. They're not assigned to fighter jets yet. So that means the weapons are not in Europe, presumably, yet. But over the next year or 2, presumably, we will see that starting to happen. So that's the status.
Thanks very much, Hans. That's brilliant. Roger, can we go to you?
Yeah, just a couple of points, if I can. One of the things that kind of struck me from the contributions from Tom and Hans is about sovereignty. With all of the debates that have been taking place in recent years, like the last 10, 15 years or whatever, about sovereignty. And yet it's completely ignored when we talk about the sovereignty of this country over the fact that most people in this country do not want nuclear weapons on these islands. They don't, but we're not asked about that. It's just assumed that people will go along with it. In fact, they don't even care whether they don't seem to bother about that as a question of sovereignty at all. We're just part of the American posse, basically, and just do what they will. The question that was asked directly to me was about the trade unions and how we can work directly with the trade unions. I think one of the things about trade unions, who have rightly, in many ways, been prioritising campaigning and organising to raise people's standards of living so they can actually afford to put bread on the table and keep a roof over their heads. We should also remember that trade unionists can walk and talk and do things at the same time as well, so they can do other things as well as campaign against low pay. And one of the things I think is really important to remember about trade unions is that even within those unions who at the moment refuse to support the motions that many of us have been sponsoring around peace and about nuclear disarmament because they think that it will impact their members. There's loads of people within those unions who do support the line that we're taking. And if there's one thing that I know about, there's one thing that I've learned over the years as an activist within this movement, within the labour and trade union movement, within the peace movement, within all the movements that I've been part of, is that it's never over until it's over. It's never over. And we can still campaign, we can still organise, and we should work with those people within those unions to turn the opinion around within those unions. Because in the end, it'll always come down to a vote within those unions. It comes down to power within those unions. So we have to be building the power and supporting those people who support our line within those unions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Roger. Tom?
Thanks a lot. So first of all, on the question of how can people who live quite far away from Lakenheath even start to engage in this question, and is it a local one? Well, almost certainly it is not simply a local issue. Yes, people there are very, very worried about the possibility of nuclear weapons, returning to Lakenheath. But what happens at Lakenheath speaks of a bigger, much, much bigger political picture, as I hope was outlined by a variety of speakers. It raises questions about who decides, who has a say, who gets to ask questions about what happens with respect to nuclear weapons. And it raises questions about why there is such a level of secrecy or opacity around the reality of what happens. So that's the first thing. It's a question for everybody, and everybody should be lobbying and asking their MPs about these developments, what the government does know, what the government doesn't know, and indeed what they're going to do about it. But also there's the reality is that what is happening at Lakenheath is part of a bigger picture of the nuclear infrastructure in the United Kingdom, because we know, do we not? And I didn't have time to relate this in my earlier contribution. We know that Britain has nuclear weapons. That's why CND, one of the reasons CND exists in the first place. And we know the deep interconnectedness between the United States and what in Britain the government calls its independent nuclear deterrence. We know it is no such thing. We know that Britain's nuclear weapons system is wholly reliant on the United States, and that if a United States president decided to make life difficult, then the plug could be pulled and those weapons would very quickly become inoperable. So this is a question which extends across the country, really. And in terms of the nuclear infrastructure in this country, part of it maps, the geography that was alluded to earlier. It stretches north to south, east to west in this country. So I live in Nottingham. Very close to Nottingham is Derby, which hosts the Rolls-Royce plant. The Rolls-Royce plant is a place where, which is central to Britain's nuclear infrastructure so far as the current renovations of the nuclear system go. So there is something in terms of what we can campaign on for everybody to get a hold on. And even if Lakenheath is a long way from where you are, just as in the 1980s where, the slogan Greenham is everywhere, the fact of the matter is that Lakenheath is everywhere, because the developments of Lakenheath make it a target. And that target stretches across the country. And I'll stop there and we'll take some other questions.
Thanks very much, Tom. Okay, so the audience, you are doing incredibly well with all your questions. So I'm not sure we're going to be able to take all of them, but I'm just going to read a whole clump now and then go back to the speakers and ask them to pick what they would like. But first of all, we got one from Ray Street. Hi, Ray. This is for Roger. Ray's pointing out the problems, or more than problems, of mining uranium, that it's brought suffering and death to mainly indigenous peoples across the world. She says it's rarely, if ever, mentioned in the mainstream media. How can we alert the general public to the problem? Alex is raising, and there's someone else is also raising the question of the NPT and the whole legality of what's going on in terms of the treaty. The nuclear weapons coming, would that be a violation of the treaty, the NPT? And then from Carol Turner, she says, this is for Roger, CND adopted an explicit policy at our conference last year to bring the impact of nuclear weapons possessing states on the global south to the fore in our campaigning. Would you indicate, please, what the most important issues to take up are, in your opinion? Sylvia says, how can campaigning include not only direct means on nuclear bombs and bases, but also, given the importance of remembering the effects on the global south, campaign for the signing of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which obviously looks at those terrible, terrible problems for the first time, pretty much. And then Keith Prince. Keith, you're living locally to Lakenheath. You say, I live under the approach to Lakenheath. Today it's been fairly quiet, though the last couple of days have been very busy. I note F-15s from Lakenheath have been involved in airstrikes on Syria from forward bases. According to the Lakenheath news site, I also note B-52 bombers have used Mildenhall in the past, though some years ago. My question is around protests at Lakenheath. In the past, they have either been at the main gate where the road is quite narrow, or at the viewing area where plane spotters and burger vans go. This is away from the main road and public view. Where would future protests be more effective? Great question. And then there's a couple on the same issue. These are from Patrick Black and Sophie Bolt, basically drawing our attention to the speech a couple of weeks ago by Grant Shapps, Secretary of State for so-called defence. This is where he says that we're in a pre-war, not a post-war situation, suggesting British people need to be prepared for war. Would the speakers like to comment on this and how this narrative is being used to justify and push for these weapons coming to Lakenheath? So any comments you have on that speech? Barbara Hardcastle, that's also about the NPT, doesn't prohibit deployment of nuclear weapons, but TPNW does. How can we move this on? And then Linda Rogers, what pushback can we have against the proclamation by Johnson, was it, that yes, it was in the integrated review in 2021, that UK government would no longer make public our nuclear weapons capacity? Are there international laws on transparency? So that was part of the integrated review. No more shared info. Well, that's a lot, but, you know, pick and choose, please, colleagues. So, Hans, if you don't mind going first again.
Okay, thanks very much. On the speech, I only saw I haven't read it. I just saw these references to it. And whether that mindset is being used, well, you know, the mindset or the observations and conclusions that lead to this mindset are part of what is also shaping, of course, the military posture, including the nuclear posture in Europe. And so one of the things they have been very busy with over the last several years is how to, this is in response to long-range conventional weapons in the Russian inventory, is to try to increase the security of the weapons and reduce their vulnerability to those kind of attacks. And so that places increased emphasis on sort of dispersal schedules or dispersal plans. And so I suspect somehow, until I hear more about actual deployment at Lakenheath, that is one of the potential functions for or reasons for what's happening at Lakenheath, to create that kind of increased flexibility of moving things around as needed. So whether that has a particular bearing on the B6112, don't really think so, in the sense that I don't see that NATO is very eager to necessarily increase nuclear weapons in Europe. That's not what it's about. It's about safeguarding the posture that is there and modernizing it and making it more flexible, that type of stuff. So that will continue whether or not there are nuclear weapons transferred to Lakenheath.
Thanks very much, Hans. Roger?
Yeah, a couple of things. I'll be as quick as I can. The US have been really clear about their intentions, actually. They've said that they have this policy called full spectrum dominance, which means, as far as they're concerned, they will protect the economic interests of the United States by land, by sea, by air, in space, everywhere, right? They have made that really clear. So if that's the case, then we need to work on that basis and develop our own full spectrum resistance to the way that the United States is told us already that they're going to behave. And for that, and this links to some of the points that were raised directly to me, that's why I think it's important that our response is full spectrum. It is fully across the planet, that it involves not just us saying to people in the global south that this is what we think you should do, or this is, you know, the problem that's facing you, oh, poor you lots. What we need to be doing is to looking at ways of empowering those people within the global south. And that's where I think formations like BRICS is important. That's where I think formations like the G77 plus China is important, because I think those bodies give us an opportunity for an input, a way in to be able to help build the movements that are absolutely necessary within the global south to bring about peace. I'm absolutely against the idea that we should be telling people in the Global South how to do this. I think they know. I think they need assistance and our solidarity in being able to build the movements that they're trying to do already. One of the most kind of, as somebody who works in the media, my day job as the international editor for the Morning Star, I think we have to call out the complicity of the media in all of this, in the way that they have refused to tell the truth. Tom was saying earlier on about truth is important, and absolutely nailed it, I think. I think that is so correct. And we have to find ways of being able to make sure that truth gets out there. We won't do that by continually just talking to each other. It's really important that we do talk to each other, that we give each other strength and support, but we also need to find ways of expanding that information and putting the word out in a much kind of wider basis. So I think it's really challenging for us, but I think it's something that we can do if we harness the sort of power and the enthusiasm that I know exists within organizations like CND, of people wanting to go out there and have conversations with people who may not at this moment actually agree with us, but I'm absolutely convinced if we reach them, will agree with us. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Roger. 100% agreeing there. Tom, over to you for the rousing finale.
I'll try my best. Look, Grant Shapps, let's be clear. Grant Shapps, the United Kingdom Secretary of State for Defence, is an absolute joke on an individual level. If anybody who's followed his career in politics will know and will see that he's a serial liar, a serial fantasist. Now, here's a man who operates under numerous different names, or has at least has done in the past. And so you might make the mistake of looking at his comments and his warnings that we're in a pre-war situation and just dismissing them as yet the latest utterances and the latest idiotic statements from a complete and utter joke figure. But he is still the Secretary of State for Defence, the Minister of Defence in the United Kingdom, a nuclear-armed state, a state with a long history of bloody imperialism, a nuclear-armed state with a very large army and armed forces capability, which is in direct alliance with the United States, the largest army known in the history of the world, the largest military force known in the history of the world. And when he says stuff like that, he hasn't written his own speeches. Somebody has written them for him, and he's there as a ventriloquist for what the global military powers are thinking. And they are thinking that, and they are drawing those conclusions because their entire policy, the way they act in the world, all of the developments, everything they do and say is pointed in the direction of confrontation. And it's a very, very, very dangerous situation that we face. And the question, therefore, is what can we do about it? And I think that's the important question, because there is nobody in British politics, just in the same way there's nobody in American politics who's going to ride on a white horse to come and save us from this. If you look at the current policy of the major opposition party, the party that all of the polls suggest is going to form the next government, in reality, there is not very much between them when it comes to foreign and military policy. And certainly there is nothing between them when it comes to nuclear weapons policy. So somebody asked a question about the opacity or the lack of information introduced by Johnson's integrated review. Who's going to change it? Well, not the Labour Party, not the next government, certainly not any potential replacement for the current Prime Minister should the Tories decide to change the decks before voters go to the polls. And therefore it is up to us, as it always has been, it is up to us, the peace movements, organisations like CND, to be very, very clear about what is going on and to force the issue, to force the issue. Now, we're not used to forcing the issue. We're part of the peace movement. We're part of the peace campaign. The idea of using force is often anathema to us. But the times are so dangerous. The reality of nuclear tensions is so incredibly dangerous that we have no alternative but to massively increase our levels of activity, to massively increase the amount of noise we make, and to spread our message far and wide. And that doesn't just mean in this country. It means working with as many people as we can in the United States, and probably more importantly, echoing Roger's points, it means working with the global non-nuclear, non-militaristic majority. Because the stakes are very high, the situation is incredibly dangerous. The US, regardless of whether or not they're expanding their nuclear presence in Europe, they're certainly about to intensify their nuclear presence in Europe with the new generation of jets and the new nuclear bomb with all of its increased capabilities. The situation is dangerous. And at the risk of using a cliche, now more than ever, the work of CND and the peace movements is incredibly important. So if you're not already a member, join. If you are a member, redouble your efforts and raise the alarm, spread the word, and use all of the information we have from people like Hans, all of the information we have from our legacy of campaigning to make sure that those who have power or who seek power know that they will not get away with making the situation even more deadly than it already is. That's it.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. And before I thank our marvellous speakers, I want to thank you, the audience, for making this so incredibly interesting through your fantastic questions and what you've been putting in the chat. Just to say, yes, everyone will get the recording of this, and we will also put in the message and the email from me. I'll include the links that have been put in the chat there. So you will get all the information. Please feel free to share it as far and wide as you can. So that's great. So the next action, specifically, organised action around Lakenheath, is on May the 11th. That is a CND Day of Action countrywide. So there'll be a lot of different activities going on, as Tom described it as reference back to Greenham is everywhere, Lakenheath is everywhere. Another reference back is carry Lakenheath home, as we carried Greenham home, and so on. So we'll all be doing what we can on that day. Please do something. Please get involved with your local CND group around that. If you want to be involved in the sort of local and regional action which is taking place at Lakenheath, it's currently being planned and organised and so on, do please get in touch either with Norwich CND, or you can directly email Sophie Bolt, one of the CND Vice-Chairs, who's working with the local campaigns there to pull that action together. And Sophie's email is there in the chat. So find one way or another to really get involved on that day. That's absolutely brilliant. I know there's a lot of other things going on. I'm sure you're all out all the time on demonstrations, but we just really do have to do everything we can for to try and bring peace, ceasefire, diplomacy, negotiation, equal and sustainable development. These are things we're all committed to, and we will work together to those ends. So a big thank you, our fantastic speakers. You've given us such a really interesting, stimulating and motivational session. So thank you, speakers. Thank you, everybody. And let's keep on organising. Bye-bye.